The church smelled of lilies and old wood polish, the same scent that had marked every milestone of our family's life. Baptisms, confirmations, my wedding 12 years ago. And now this. I stood at the pulpit, looking out at the sea of faces that had come to say goodbye to Robert Fitzgerald, and felt the weight of being the eldest, the responsible one, the daughter who always knew what to say. My father was a man who understood that family comes first. I began, my voice steady despite the tremor in my chest. For 40 years, he and my mother built something beautiful together. 3 children who never doubted we were loved, a business that employed half this neighborhood, a home that was always open to anyone who needed a meal or a kind word. The words came easily because they were true. Dad had coached David's Little League teams while running Fitzgerald construction during the day. He'd sat through every one of Emma's high school art shows, asking thoughtful questions about color and composition. When I'd struggled through law school, overwhelmed and ready to quit, he'd driven 3 hours just to take me to dinner and remind me that Fitzgeralds don't give up. Robert Fitzgerald was a man of his word, I continued, catching sight of Mom in the front row, tissue pressed to her eyes, but back straight, dignified even in grief. When he promised something, you could count on it. When he loved you, you never had to wonder. A movement in the back caught my eye, a woman in black rising from her seat, moving toward the exit. Something about her urgency struck me as odd, but people grieve differently. Maybe she couldn't handle the emotion of it all. Dad always said that how you treat your family is how you'll be judged when your time comes. By that measure, Robert Fitzgerald was a man who lived well. I paused, looking down at the notes I'd written but no longer needed. He leaves behind a legacy of love, integrity, and devotion that will carry on in every life he touched. The applause was soft, respectful. As I returned to my seat, David squeezed my shoulder and Emma reached for my hand. We sat there, the 5 of us who had been Dad's whole world. Mom, me, David, Emma, and Dad's brother, Uncle Jim, united in our grief, but also in our certainty that we'd been blessed with something rare and precious. We buried Robert Fitzgerald on a Tuesday in March, under skies so gray they seemed to be mourning with us. The lawyer's office felt too bright, too sterile for what should have been a simple formality. William Preston had been Dad's attorney for 15 years, handling everything from business contracts to the will Mom and Dad had updated just last Christmas. He was a thin man with kind eyes who had served us coffee in real china cups, a gesture that seemed both thoughtful and ominous. "I want you to know," Preston said, adjusting his glasses as he opened the file, "that your father was very specific about his intentions. He met with me several times over the past year to ensure everything was in order." "Of course he did," Mom said, her voice still carrying that hollow quality it had since the funeral. "Robert was always careful about details." I sat with my legal pad ready, prepared to walk the family through the standard divisions: the house to Mom, the business assets split between the 3 kids, Dad's retirement accounts distributed according to his wishes. Clean, simple, exactly what you'd expect from a man who kept meticulous records and never left anything to chance. Preston cleared his throat. "The will names 6 beneficiaries." The words hung in the air like smoke. 6. I counted automatically. Mom, me, David, Emma. That was 4. "I'm sorry, what?" David leaned forward in his chair. 6? "Your father's estate is to be divided among Margaret Fitzgerald, Sarah Fitzgerald, David Fitzgerald, Emma Fitzgerald, Elena Fitzgerald, and Marcus Fitzgerald." The silence that followed was deafening. I felt my professional composure, the same steady calm that had carried me through hostile depositions and jury arguments, beginning to crack. "Who are Elena and Marcus Fitzgerald?" I asked, my voice sharp enough to cut glass. Preston folded his hands. "I can only share what's outlined in the will itself. I'm not at liberty to discuss the background or circumstances." "The hell you can't!" Emma's artist temperament, usually channeled into her paintings, flared hot and immediate. We're talking about our father's will, our inheritance. We have a right to know who these people are. Emma. Mom's voice was barely a whisper, but it carried enough weight to quiet the room. Elena and Marcus Fitzgerald. They have Robert's last name. The implications settled over us like ice water. Preston shifted uncomfortably but maintained his professional distance. The will provides addresses for all beneficiaries, he said carefully. It also includes specific bequests and instructions for the division of assets. I can walk you through those details if you'd like. But I was no longer listening. My mind was racing through the possibilities, each one worse than the last. A secret marriage? Impossible. Dad was married to Mom. Adopted children we'd never heard of? Why would he keep that a secret? An affair? The word sat in my throat like poison, but I couldn't swallow it down. We need copies of everything, I said, falling back into lawyer mode because it was the only way to think clearly. Every document, every clause, every instruction.
Preston nodded, already reaching for his files. Of course, though I should mention, there are time-sensitive elements to consider. The estate needs to be settled within 6 months, and some assets are already encumbered by business debts. We left the office with a stack of papers and a silence that stretched between us like a chasm. In the parking lot, standing beside our cars, we looked at each other with the bewildered expression of people who had just discovered they were strangers to themselves. "We'll figure this out," David said, because that's what David always said, the middle child, the peacemaker, the one who believed every problem had a reasonable solution. But as I drove home with Preston's documents on the passenger seat, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't going to figure anything out. We were going to discover that everything we thought we knew about our family was built on lies. The family meeting happened in Mom's kitchen, because that's where we'd always gathered for important conversations. Homework help, relationship troubles, career decisions, all of it had been hashed out around the scarred oak table where Mom still kept Dad's coffee mug in its usual spot. Now that same table held Preston's documents, spread like evidence of a crime. "I've gone through everything twice," I said, tapping my pen against my legal pad. "Elena Fitzgerald, 52 years old, lives at 1247 Maple Street. Marcus Fitzgerald, 19, same address. The will refers to them as my beloved Elena and my son Marcus." Emma made a sound like she'd been punched. "His son?" "According to this, yes." I kept my voice level, clinical. "Elena receives the same percentage of liquid assets as Mom. Marcus gets the same as each of us kids, including a trust for college expenses." Mom sat at the head of the table where Dad used to sit, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had long gone cold. She looked smaller than I had ever seen her, as if grief and shock had physically diminished her. 40 years, she said, to no one in particular. "We were married 40 years. David reached across the table to cover her hand with his. "Mom, we don't know what this is yet. Maybe there's an explanation." "What explanation?" Emma stood abruptly, pacing to the window that looked out over the garden Dad had planted for Mom's 50th birthday. "He had another family, David, another wife, another son. While we were growing up thinking we were his whole world, he was playing house with someone else." "We don't know that's what happened," David insisted, but his voice lacked conviction. I pulled out the copy of Dad's personal effects inventory that Preston had included. "There's something else, a key to a safety deposit box we didn't know about. And look at this," I held up a small address book photocopied from Dad's desk drawer. 2 addresses for Elena Fitzgerald, one current, one from 20 years ago. The math was unavoidable. Marcus was 19. If Elena had been in Dad's life for 20 years, "He was cheating on Mom when I was still in high school," Emma said flatly, "when we were all still living at home." Mom finally looked up from her tea. "I need to see them." "Mom, I don't think that's—" David started. "I need to see them," she repeated, and her voice carried the quiet authority that had ruled our household growing up. "I need to understand what my marriage was." I closed a file and made the decision that would change everything. Then we'll go see them, all of us." "Sarah?" David tried again. "No." I stood up, feeling the familiar surge of control that came with taking charge. "We're going to get answers. We're going to find out who these people are and what they meant to Dad, and then we're going to decide what we do about it." Emma turned from the window, her face set with the same determination that had carried her through art school despite Dad's gentle suggestions about more practical careers. When? Tomorrow. I was already mentally preparing, the way I did before a difficult deposition. "I'll drive to the Maple Street address after work. If Elena and Marcus are real, if they're really part of this family we never knew existed, then we need to meet them." Mom nodded slowly. "Yes, we need to know." As we gathered up the papers and prepared to leave, I found myself looking around the kitchen where I'd eaten thousands of meals, shared countless conversations, celebrated birthdays and holidays and ordinary Tuesday dinners. The same kitchen where Dad had helped me with calculus homework, where he'd given me advice about boys and college and my first job. Had he been thinking about Elena and Marcus during those moments? Had they felt as real and important to him as we did? The questions followed me home, and they were still there when I woke up the next morning, ready to meet the other half of my father's life. Elena's house sat on a street I'd driven past hundreds of times without really seeing. Working-class neighborhood, small lots, houses that had been built in the 50s and maintained with varying degrees of success. Hers was tidy but modest, white siding that needed paint, a small front porch with 2 chairs and the pot of flowers that someone clearly tended with care.
I sat in my car for 10 minutes, gathering courage I didn't know I needed. Through the front window, I could see movement, the flicker of a television. Normal life happening inside, while my world tilted on its axis outside. The woman who answered the door was not what I'd expected. Shorter than me, with graying brown hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, and tired eyes that suggested she'd been working long shifts for years. She wore scrubs, hospital scrubs, I realized, and looked like she'd rather be anywhere else. "You must be Sarah?" she said, and her voice carried a resignation that caught me off guard. "How did you... she looked like him?" Elena stepped aside to let me in. "Robert always said his oldest daughter could probably argue a case before the Supreme Court. I'm guessing that's you." The living room was small but comfortable, decorated with the careful attention of someone who doesn't have much money but takes pride in what she has. Family photos covered the mantel. And there he was, Dad. My father, looking exactly as I remembered him, with his arm around Elena at what looked like a barbecue. Another photo showed him teaching a young boy to ride a bike. Another had him in a graduation cap and gown, standing next to a teenager who shared his smile. "How long?" I managed. Elena settled into a chair across from me, her hands folded in her lap. 22 years. We met when your mother was sick, the cancer scare when you were in college. I was her night nurse for a few weeks. I remembered Mom's cancer scare, the terror that had gripped all of us, and the relief when the treatments worked, the gratitude we'd felt for the medical team that had saved her life. One of those nurses had been Elena. "He told me she was dying," Elena continued quietly. "Said the doctors weren't telling the family yet, but the cancer was worse than they'd admitted. He was so scared, so lost. I'd see him in the waiting room every night, and She shrugged. I felt sorry for him. But she wasn't dying. No, she got better, thank God. But by then," Elena gestured helplessly, "by then we'd become friends. He kept coming by the hospital even after Margaret was discharged, said he needed someone to talk to about how scared he'd been." A young man emerged from what I assumed was the kitchen, tall and lean, with Dad's dark hair and serious expression. He stopped when he saw me, and the family resemblance was unmistakable. "This is Marcus, your half-brother."
The word brother hit me like a physical blow. I had two brothers, David and the little brother who died when I was 8, too young for me to remember clearly. I didn't have a half-brother who was 19 and looked like a younger version of my father. "I'm sorry about your dad," Marcus said, and his voice cracked slightly. "Our dad, I guess. This is all pretty weird." Weird didn't begin to cover it. "Were you—" I stopped, then forced myself to continue. "Were you planning to contact us after the funeral?" Elena and Marcus exchanged a glance. "We didn't know about you," Elena admitted. "I mean, I knew Robert had been married before, had grown children from his first marriage, but I thought you were all adults living your own lives, that you and Robert weren't close anymore." The room seemed to tilt. "First marriage?" "He told me he'd been divorced for 15 years, Elena said, confusion creeping into her voice. "That Margaret was his ex-wife, that they stayed in touch because of you kids, but that was all." I stared at her, processing this information. Dad had told Elena that he was divorced. He'd told us nothing about Elena and Marcus at all. Both sides of his life had been built on lies. "Our parents were married for 40 years, I said slowly. "They renewed their vows on their anniversary last year. I was there." Elena's face went pale. "That's not," he said. "He lied to both of us." Marcus slumped onto the couch. Jesus. I knew something was weird about why he could never stay over on weekends, why he was always checking his phone, why he'd disappear for days at a time. But I thought it was work stuff. Elena stood up abruptly, walking to the mantel where the photos of her life with my father smiled down at us. 22 years, she whispered. "I thought he was my wife." "Were you married?" I asked, though I was afraid of the answer. "Common law. In this state, after 7 years," she trailed off. "But if he was still married to Margaret, then it wouldn't be legal," I finished. "You can't have 2 wives." The silence that followed was broken by the sound of Elena crying. Quiet, wrenching sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than grief. I sat there watching this woman I'd never heard of fall apart and felt something crack open in my chest. "I'm sorry," I said, though I wasn't sure what I was apologizing for. "I'm so sorry." Marcus moved to comfort his mother, and I saw myself in the gesture. The eldest child, the one who takes care of everyone else. How many times had he done this over the years? How many times had he watched Elena wait for a man who was never going to fully commit to their family because he already had another one?
"What do we do now?" Marcus asked, looking at me with eyes that were so much like Dad's it hurt. I thought about the will, about the inheritance that was supposed to be divided 6 ways instead of 4. I thought about my mother's broken expression and Emma's rage and David's desperate desire to fix everything. I thought about my own marriage, my own life that had suddenly become infinitely more complicated. "I don't know," I admitted, "but I think we need to figure it out together." Getting both families in the same room was like negotiating a ceasefire between warring nations. Mom insisted on meeting at her house, our house, the family home where we'd grown up. And I couldn't tell if it was because she wanted the comfort of familiar surroundings or because she needed to establish territorial dominance. Elena arrived exactly on time, wearing a dress instead of her usual scrubs and looking like she was heading to her own execution. Marcus had opted out, claiming he had a class, though I suspected he just couldn't handle the emotional warfare that was about to unfold.
David and Emma flanked Mom at the kitchen table like bodyguards. I had tried to convince Emma to skip this meeting, knowing her temper, but she'd refused. "I want to see her," Emma had said. "I want to see the woman who helped destroy our family." Now, watching Elena perch nervously on the edge of Dad's chair, I realized how wrong that characterization was. Elena hadn't destroyed anything. If anyone was the villain in this story, it was Dad himself, the man we'd all loved, who loved us all back while lying to everyone involved. "I don't know where to start," Mom said, her voice tight with barely controlled emotion. "Neither do I. I never wanted to hurt anyone. I thought... Robert told me that he was divorced." Mom's laugh was bitter. "Yes, Sarah explained your version of events." "It wasn't a version," Elena said quietly. "It was what I believed to be true." Emma leaned forward, her artist's eye studying Elena with uncomfortable intensity. "For 22 years, you never questioned it? Never wondered why he couldn't introduce you to his ex-wife and kids?" "He said you all hated him," Elena admitted, color rising in her cheeks. "That the divorce was ugly, that you blamed him for breaking up the family. He said trying to force contact would just make things worse for everyone." David, ever the peacemaker, cleared his throat. "What we're trying to understand is how this went on for so long without anyone knowing. Dad was with us for holidays, family dinners, vacations. He traveled for work, construction projects all over the region. Sometimes he'd be gone for weeks at a time." She paused, then added quietly, "I thought he was working. I thought he was trying to build a future for Marcus and me." The pieces were falling into place, creating a picture none of us wanted to see. Dad compartmentalizing his life with the precision of a master craftsman. Work trips that were really time with his first family, late nights at the office that were actually dinners with Elena and Marcus, a double life so carefully constructed that both sides could exist without ever touching. "The money," Mom said suddenly. "The construction business did well, but there were always expenses I didn't understand. Equipment purchases, project costs that seemed high." He was supporting both households, I realized. 2 mortgages, 2 families, double everything. Elena nodded miserably. He insisted on paying for everything. Mortgage, Marcus's school clothes, my car payments. I worked, but Robert always said he wanted to take care of us. While telling us he was being careful with money for retirement, Emma said, her voice sharp with betrayal. The silence that followed was thick with the weight of 22 years of deception. I found myself studying both women. My mother, who had built her entire adult identity around being Robert Fitzgerald's wife, and Elena, who had done the same thing, believing she was his only real partner. "I need to ask you something," Mom said finally, her voice steadier than it had been since the funeral. Elena nodded. "Did you love him?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Elena's eyes filled with tears, but she met Mom's gaze directly. "Yes," she whispered. "I loved him more than I've ever loved anyone. He was my whole world." Mom absorbed this, her face unreadable. Then, to everyone's surprise, she started crying. Not the angry tears I'd expected, but something deeper and more broken. Mine too. He was my whole world too. In that moment, I understood something that all my legal training hadn't prepared me for. There were no winners here. No innocent parties and guilty ones. Just 2 women who had loved the same man completely, and a man who'd been too weak or too selfish to choose between them. "What do we do now?" David asked, echoing Marcus's question from the day before. I looked around the kitchen, where I'd learned to be a Fitzgerald, at the 2 women whose lives had been shattered by the same secret, at my siblings who were struggling to reconcile the father they'd known with the man he'd actually been. "We figure out how to be a family," I said. All of us. The coffee shop was neutral territory. Not Mom's kitchen with its 40 years of memories, not Elena's living room with its evidence of Dad's double life, just a busy Starbucks where we could pretend we were normal people having a normal conversation about normal family business.
Marcus looked younger than his 19 years, hunched over a venti coffee that he kept gripping like a lifeline. Across from him, David was doing his best impression of a welcoming older brother, asking questions about school and career plans with forced enthusiasm. I watched this awkward dance while fighting my own internal battle. For 3 weeks since the revelation, I'd been existing in a state of cognitive dissonance that was affecting every aspect of my life. At work, I found myself staring at family law cases with new understanding of how complicated domestic situations could become. At home, my husband Michael had started asking careful questions about why I was so distracted, so quick to anger at small problems. How do you explain that everything you thought you knew about yourself was built on a foundation of lies? So you're majoring in engineering, David was asking Marcus. Yeah, civil. Same as Dad wanted to do before he started the construction business. Marcus's face lit up when he talked about his studies, and the resemblance to Dad was almost painful. He always said he wanted to build things that would last longer than he would. Emma, who had been silent since we had arrived, made a small sound of distress. He used to tell me the same thing about my art, that creating something beautiful was the closest humans could get to immortality. The realization hit all of us simultaneously. Dad had been the same person with both families. Same values, same wisdom, probably the same terrible jokes, probably. He hadn't been performing or pretending. He'd been genuinely himself with all of us, which somehow made the betrayal worse. I keep thinking about Christmas morning when I was 16, Marcus said quietly. Dad was there when I woke up, making pancakes in our kitchen, acting like Santa Claus had personally delivered every gift under our tree. I was old enough to know he must have been up all night assembling my bike and wrapping presents, but young enough to think it was magic. He paused. Where was he supposed to be that morning? David and Emma exchanged glances. I knew what they were remembering. Christmas morning 16, when Dad had shown up late for our family breakfast, claiming he'd been called out for an emergency repair at a construction site. We'd grumbled about him missing our traditional pancake breakfast, but we'd understood. Business came first when there was an emergency. Except there hadn't been an emergency. There had been another son, opening presents in another house, believing he was the center of his father's world. He was supposed to be with us, Emma said flatly, making pancakes for us, watching us open presents, being our dad. He was being your dad, Marcus replied, and there was no malice in it, just confusion. I don't understand how he managed to be everyone's dad at the same time. Neither did I. The logistics alone seemed impossible. 2 families, 2 sets of obligations, 2 complete lives that somehow never intersected, despite existing in the same city for over 20 years. My phone buzzed with a text from the estate attorney. Need decisions on house sale by Friday. Market is good, but need to move quickly. We have a problem, I said, showing them the message. The estate has to be settled in 3 months. The house needs to be sold to satisfy the terms of the will. David's face fell. Mom's not ready to move. She can barely get through a day without falling apart. Maybe she doesn't have to, Marcus said slowly. What if someone bought the house who would let her stay? We all looked at him. I mean, if one of the beneficiaries purchased it at market value, the estate would be satisfied, right? And then they could work out whatever living arrangement made sense. It was a good idea, the kind of creative problem-solving Dad would have been proud of. But the financial reality made it complicated. None of us have that kind of cash, Emma said. The house is worth at least $300,000. What about a mortgage? Marcus asked. I've got good credit, and with the inheritance as a down payment. I stared at this 19-year-old who's proposing to buy his half-sibling's childhood home to protect their mother's emotional well-being. Marcus, that's incredibly generous, but you're talking about taking on massive debt to help people you barely know. You're not people I barely know, he said simply. You're my family. The word hung in the air between us. Family. I'd been struggling with what that meant in the context of our bizarre situation, but Marcus seemed to have figured it out more quickly than any of us. I'll co-sign, I heard myself saying. "If that's what you really want to do." David nodded. "Me too." Emma remained silent, but she didn't object. "I need to talk to my mom first. This affects her too." As we prepared to leave, Marcus touched my arm. "Can I ask you something?" I nodded. "Are you angry at him? At Dad?" It was the question I'd been avoiding, even in my own thoughts. Was I angry at Robert Fitzgerald, the man who raised me and loved me and taught me to believe in the importance of integrity and family commitment? "Yes," I said finally, "and I hate that I'm angry at him because it feels like losing him all over again." Marcus nodded. "Yeah, me too." Elena's reaction to Marcus's house plan surprised everyone, most of all me. I'd expected her to be protective, to worry about her son taking on such a massive financial commitment. Instead, she seemed relieved.
"It's a good house for a family," she said, looking around Mom's kitchen with what might have been wistfulness. "Robert always talked about this kitchen. He said some of his happiest memories were made at this table." Mom, who had been silent through most of the discussion, finally spoke. "He proposed to me in this kitchen, 41 years ago, right here where I'm sitting." The statement could have been cruel, a pointed reminder of who had been first, who was legally married, whose claim to Robert Fitzgerald was documented and recognized. But Mom's voice carried no malice, only sadness. "He never proposed to me," Elena said quietly. "I kept waiting, especially after Marcus was born, but he always had a reason why it wasn't the right time. Too much stress with the business, or you kids were going through something important, or the economy was uncertain." She paused. "I should have realized he was already married." "Would it have mattered?" Emma asked, and for once her question wasn't an accusation. Elena considered this. "I don't know. I loved him so much, and Marcus needed a father. Robert was so good with him, so present and involved. I might have talked myself into believing it was temporary, that eventually he'd get divorced and we could be a real family." "You were a real family," I said, surprising myself with the conviction in my voice. "Maybe not legally, but emotionally. Dad was present with you, wasn't he? He showed up for Marcus's school events and soccer games and parent-teacher conferences." "Never missed one," Elena confirmed. "Then you were a real family. The legal stuff is just paperwork." It was a strange moment of clarity for me. The corporate lawyer who had built her career on the importance of legal documentation and proper procedures. But sitting in that kitchen, looking at the evidence of my father's double life, I realized that love and commitment couldn't always be measured by contracts and certificates. Marcus and Elena exchanged glances. "There's something else we need to tell you about the business." My stomach dropped. "What about the business?" Elena said, "Robert made me a partner. Not officially, but he put money into an account for business expenses and gave me signatory authority. I've been handling the administrative side for the past 5 years. Payroll, scheduling, client communications." David leaned forward. "We wondered why the books were so organized. Dad was good at construction, but paperwork was never his strong suit." Elena continued. "The crew thinks I'm just the office manager, but I know every project, every client relationship, every vendor account. If the business is going to continue operating until the estate is settled," I finished, "it needs you." Elena nodded. "And I need the income. The inheritance will help, but I can't live on it indefinitely." Another piece of Dad's complex puzzle fell into place. He hadn't just been supporting 2 families, he'd been integrating Elena into his business, giving her a role that made her essential to its operation. Even his professional life had been built around maintaining both relationships. "What do you propose?" I asked. Elena said, "Let me buy out the business. At fair market value applied against the estate. I know how to run it, I have relationships with the crew and the clients, and it gives all of you a guaranteed return on Dad's investment." Emma spoke up for the first time in an hour. "And Marcus gets the house, you get the business, and we all get our inheritance from the sales. Everyone wins." "Except for Mom," David pointed out. "She loses her home and her husband's business." Mom, who had been listening to this conversation with an expression I couldn't read, finally spoke. "I never wanted the business. Robert tried to teach me about it over the years, but I was never interested. And as for the house,
She looked around the kitchen one more time. Maybe it's time for a new chapter. Mom, I started. Sarah, honey, I'm 70 years old. I don't need 4 bedrooms and a yard I can't maintain. If Marcus wants to buy this house and start his own family here someday, that feels right to me. The generosity of it took my breath away. After everything she had been through, everything she had lost, Mom was still thinking about what would be best for all of us. Where will you live? David asked. Mom smiled, the first genuine smile I'd seen from her since the funeral. I always wanted to try condo living. One of those places with a community pool and organized activities. Your father thought it sounded ridiculous, but maybe ridiculous is exactly what I need. 6 months after Dad's funeral, we gathered at the lawyer's office to finalize the estate settlement. All 6 beneficiaries, though we looked more like a functional family than we had at the beginning of this process. Marcus had gotten his mortgage approval, with me and David as co-signers, and Elena contributing her business purchase as additional collateral. The construction company would officially become Fitzgerald and Associates, with Elena as the primary owner. Mom had found a condo she loved in a community 20 minutes away, close enough for regular visits, but far enough to feel like a fresh start. Emma had surprised everyone by asking Elena to teach her the business side of Dad's work. She said, I might want to start my own art consulting business someday. I could use some mentoring from a successful businesswoman.
The legal documents were thick and complex, but the emotional weight of signing them felt lighter than I'd expected. We weren't erasing Dad's deception or pretending it hadn't caused tremendous pain. We were simply choosing to build something better from the wreckage. There's one more thing, Preston said as we prepared to leave. He handed me a sealed envelope with my name written in Dad's familiar handwriting. He left individual letters for each of you. We decided to read them together, back at the house, Marcus's house now, around the kitchen table where so many family conversations had taken place. Dad's letter to me was 3 pages long, written in his careful script. Sarah, if you're reading this, then you know the truth about the life I've been living, and I'm not there to explain myself. I'm not sure any explanation would be sufficient anyway. I need you to know that everything I told you about being proud of you, about believing in your strength and intelligence and integrity, was absolutely true. You are everything I hoped you would become, and more. You have your mother's grace and your grandfather's determination, and you've built a life that honors both. I also need you to know that I am ashamed, not of Elena and Marcus, they deserve better than that, but of the lies I told everyone I loved in order to keep both parts of my life intact. I convinced myself I was protecting you all, but I was really just protecting myself from having to make an impossible choice. When I met Elena, your mother was sick, and I was terrified of losing her. Elena was kind to me during the worst time of my life, and when Margaret recovered, I should have walked away. Instead, I told Elena that my marriage was over and told myself that a friendship wouldn't hurt anyone. But friendship became more, and by the time Marcus was born, I was so deep in deception that I couldn't see a way out that wouldn't destroy everything. So I kept lying, kept compartmentalizing, kept telling myself that I could be everything to everyone if I just managed the logistics carefully enough. The truth is that I loved both families completely. I was never pretending with any of you. Every moment of pride in your achievements, every piece of advice I gave you, every expression of love was absolutely genuine. But I realize now that love without honesty is selfish, and I have been profoundly selfish. I know this puts you in an impossible position as the eldest, as the one everyone looks to for guidance. I'm asking you to do something I should have done years ago. Help this family find a way to be whole. Not the way I tried to do it with lies and compartments, but honestly. Elena and Marcus are good people who deserve your consideration, not your anger. Your mother deserves your support as she processes a betrayal I never intended, but absolutely caused. David and Emma deserve space to feel however they need to feel about me and about this situation. And you, my brilliant daughter, deserve to know that even though I failed at being the man you thought I was never failing at loving you. You were always real to me. You were always my pride and joy. That part was never a lie.
Please don't let my mistakes destroy what we built together as a family. Instead, maybe you can build something even better. Something honest. I love you, Dad." I finished reading and looked up to find everyone watching me, their own letters clutched in their hands. "What did he say to you?" David asked quietly. "That he was sorry, that he loved us all, that he wants us to figure out how to be a family without the lies." I folded the letter carefully. "What about yours?" Marcus cleared his throat. "He told me I was his son in every way that mattered, and that he hoped someday I'd have the courage he couldn't find to do the right thing from the beginning." Emma's letter had made her cry. She said he was proud of my art and that he hoped I'd paint something beautiful about forgiveness someday, because he thought I might be the only one in the family strong enough to really forgive him. David's message was shorter. He asked me to take care of everyone, the way I always have. He said he knew I'd find a way to help the family heal. Mom's letter was the longest, and she didn't share the details. "He apologized," she said simply, "and he told me he hoped I'd find happiness with someone who deserved me." Elena's hands shook as she read her letter. "He said he was sorry for lying to me, and that I deserved a man who could choose me completely. He asked me to help his children understand that I never meant to hurt anyone." We sat in silence for a while, each processing our private conversations with a man who was no longer there to answer our questions, or accept our anger, or receive our forgiveness. "So what now?" Emma asked, echoing the question that had become our family motto. I looked around the table, at Mom, who was learning to rebuild her identity at 70, at David, who was figuring out how to be a big brother to a 19-year-old he'd just met, at Emma, who was channeling her anger into curiosity about the business side of Dad's life, at Elena, who was transforming from victim to partner in our strange new configuration, and at Marcus, who was taking on adult responsibilities with a maturity that would have made Dad proud.
"Now we figure out how to be the family he couldn't create for himself," I said, honestly, this time. 1 year later, we gathered for the first anniversary of Dad's death. Not at the cemetery, we'd done that privately, in our own ways, but at Marcus's house. Our house, really, since it still felt like the family home, even with new furniture and Marcus's engineering textbooks scattered on Dad's old desk. The kitchen smelled like Elena's tamales and Mom's apple pie, a combination that would have been impossible a year ago, but now seemed perfectly natural. Emma had brought flowers from her new apartment. She'd moved out of her shared studio into her own place using her portion of the inheritance, and David had supplied the wine. "I have an announcement," Mom said, as we gathered around the table. She was wearing a new dress, something brighter than the muted colors she'd favored during her marriage, and her hair was styled differently. "I'm dating someone." The silence that followed was profound. "Mom," David said carefully, that's great. Tell us about him." "His name is Frank. He is a retired teacher who lives in my condo complex, and he makes me laugh every day." Mom's smile was radiant. "We're taking a pottery class together." Emma grinned. "Dad would hate that you're taking pottery classes." "I know," Mom said, and her smile became mischievous. "Robert always said art was a waste of time unless you could make money from it. Frank says art is valuable precisely because it has no practical purpose." The ease with which we could talk about Dad now, incorporating both love and criticism into our memories of him, had taken months to develop, but it felt healthier than the false perfection we'd insisted on before learning the truth. "Speaking of announcements," Marcus said, "I got into the graduate program at State. Full scholarship." "That's wonderful," Elena beamed with maternal pride. "Your father always said you were the smartest person he knew." "All of his kids are smart," David said. "He had good taste in genetic material." It was the kind of joke that would have been impossible earlier in our process, when every reference to our biological connections was fraught with pain and confusion. Now it just made us laugh. "I have news too," Emma said. "I sold a painting, a big one, to a collector who wants to commission a series." "Emma, that's incredible!" I reached across the table to squeeze her hand. "What's the series about?" "Family portraits, but not traditional ones. Abstract representations of how family structures can be complicated and beautiful at the same time. I'm calling it The Architecture of Love." Elena raised her wine glass. "To complicated and beautiful families." "To second chances," Mom added. "To honesty." I thought about how much my own marriage had improved once I'd learned to be more direct about my feelings and fears. "To Dad," Marcus said quietly, "for giving us each other, even if he did it the wrong way." We drank to that, and I felt something settle in my chest that had been unsettled for a year. Not forgiveness exactly, but acceptance. Dad had been flawed and selfish and loving and generous, often in the same moment. He'd created a mess, but from that mess had come this, a family more honest and resilient than the one we'd started with. After dinner, while Elena and Mom cleaned up together with the comfortable efficiency of people who had learned to navigate shared space, I found myself on the back porch with Marcus. The garden Dad had planted was thriving under Marcus's care, supplemented by Elena's practical herbs and Mom's contribution of bulbs she'd transplanted from her condo. "Do you think he knew?" Marcus asked. "When he was writing those letters, do you think we'd end up here?" I considered this. I think he hoped. Dad was always good at seeing potential in people, at believing they could rise to meet challenges they didn't think they could handle. "He was manipulative," Marcus said, without heat. "Even in death, he manipulated us into taking care of each other." "Yeah," I agreed, "but maybe that's not always a bad thing." We sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun set over a garden that had been tended by 3 generations of people who would learn to love each other despite everything. My phone buzzed with a text from Michael. "How's the family dinner?" I typed back, "Complicated and beautiful." Then added, "Just like family should be." Inside, I could hear Mom laughing at something that Elena had said, David explaining something about baseball statistics to have amused Emma, the sounds of people who had chosen to build something together from the fragments of what had been broken. Dad had given us an impossible inheritance, not just money and property, but each other, complete with all the mess and pain and unexpected joy that comes with family. It had taken a year to figure out what to do with it, but I thought we were finally getting the hang of being Robert Fitzgerald's children. All of us.
The sun finished setting, and we went inside to help with the dishes and argue about what movie to watch and continue the ordinary business of being a family. It wasn't the family any of us had planned on, but it was the family we had chosen. And maybe, I thought as Emma made fun of David's movie selection, while Marcus tried to broker peace and Mom and Elena collaborated on leftover storage with the efficiency of longtime partners, maybe that was exactly what Dad had been hoping for all along. The wedding invitation was elegant but simple. Elena Vasquez and Frank Morrison request the pleasure of your company. I smiled as I read it. Mom had kept her married name professionally, but returned to her maiden name personally when she'd remarried Frank 2 years earlier. Now Elena was making the same choice, taking Frank's name while keeping Fitzgerald for the business. The wedding was small, held in the same church where we'd buried Dad 5 years earlier. It felt right somehow, this celebration of new love in the place where we'd mourned the loss of old love. Elena had asked Emma to design the flowers, David to handle the photography, and Marcus to walk her down the aisle. My job was to serve as matron of honor, a role I'd never imagined taking on for my father's former common-law wife. But Elena wasn't that anymore. She was family. She was the woman who had taught me that love could survive betrayal, that forgiveness was different from forgetting, and that sometimes the family you choose is stronger than the one you're born into. Marcus had graduated summa cum laude and was working for a firm that specialized in sustainable architecture. He'd bought a ring for his college girlfriend and was planning to propose at Christmas. The house he'd purchased to save our family's stability would become his family's foundation. David had been promoted to regional manager at his company and had started dating seriously for the first time since his divorce. Emma's art series had led to a gallery showing and several major sales. She'd moved to a larger studio and was teaching weekend classes to supplement her painting income. Mom was thriving in her retirement, traveling with Frank and taking classes in everything from French cooking to computer programming. She'd become friends with Elena, Not sisters exactly, but women who shared the experience of loving the same complicated man and learning to build something better from the aftermath. As for me, I'd made partner at my firm and specialized increasingly in collaborative family law, mediation instead of litigation, helping families find solutions instead of winning battles. My marriage to Michael was stronger than it had ever been, built on the kind of radical honesty I'd learned at our kitchen table discussions. During the reception, I found myself standing next to the table of family photos Elena had assembled. Dad smiled at us from dozens of moments: birthdays, graduations, ordinary Sunday dinners, construction site visits. Both families were represented, but now they were just one family's photos. "He would have loved this," Marcus said, joining me at the photo display. "The wedding?" "All of it, seeing everyone happy and successful and choosing to stay connected." Marcus picked up a photo of Dad teaching him to use a circular saw. "I used to be angry that he couldn't just choose one family and commit to it completely. But I think I understand now that he couldn't choose because he loved us all completely." "That doesn't excuse the lies," I said, because it was important to maintain that distinction. "No," Marcus agreed, "but it explains them. And understanding doesn't require forgiveness, just acceptance." Elena appeared beside us, radiant in her simple wedding dress, holding hands with Frank, who'd become an unexpected grandfather figure to all of us. "Thank you," she said, and I knew she wasn't just talking about the wedding arrangements. "Thank you," I replied, and I meant for showing us that family could expand without breaking, that love was more complicated than any legal document, and that sometimes the most important inheritance is the permission to start over. The band started playing, and Frank swept Elena onto the dance floor. Mom danced with David while Emma photographed everything with the artistic eye she'd inherited from Dad's attention to beauty and detail. Marcus asked his girlfriend to dance, and I watched them move together with the easy grace of people who had learned that love required both passion and honesty. Michael appeared at my side, offering his hand. "Dance with me?" As we moved onto the dance floor, I caught sight of our reflection in the church windows, all of us together, celebrating new love while honoring old loss, proving that family could be rebuilt and reimagined and made stronger by surviving the truth. Robert Fitzgerald had left us an inheritance more valuable than money, the knowledge that love is resilient enough to survive betrayal, creative enough to build bridges across impossible gaps, and generous enough to expand to include everyone who chooses to be part of the family story. The music played, and we danced, and we were whole.